The engine noise hit me before the smell did. At first I thought it was just another contractor passing on the county road behind my land, but the sound kept getting louder, echoing off the limestone walls of the old quarry like thunder trapped in a canyon. That quarry had been carved out by my grandfather almost 50 years ago, and every time I walked down there in the morning it was quiet, just turquoise water, wind across the rock, and birds settling along the rim. That morning was different. I stepped onto the ridge and froze. A white dump truck was backed right up to the edge of the quarry. Its hydraulic bed was already halfway lifted. The driver hit a lever, and a mountain of construction debris began sliding out broken drywall sheets, smashed kitchen cabinets, torn insulation, roofing shingles, even a rusted refrigerator that bounced once before crashing into the water below. The splash echoed through the pit like a gunshot. For a second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. Then I noticed who was standing beside the truck. Linda Caraway, president of the Stonebridge Hills HOA. She stood there like she was watching a sunrise instead of a crime scene, one hand wrapped around a travel coffee mug, sunglasses perched on her head, perfectly calm while thousands of pounds of trash poured into my family's land. I stormed down the gravel slope, my boots sliding on loose limestone. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" The workers froze. One of them looked at Linda. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she took a slow sip of coffee and gave me the same polite HOA smile I'd seen a dozen times at neighborhood meetings. "Oh, good," she said. "You're awake." My fists clenched. "That's private property," I snapped, pointing at the quarry. "My property. Shut that truck down right now." The driver hesitated. Linda lifted a finger, and the man stopped the hydraulic lift like she was the one signing his paycheck. Then she turned toward me, completely relaxed. "Well, Caleb," she said calmly, "we had to do something with the waste from the new homes. The neighborhood needed somewhere to dispose of construction debris." For a moment, I honestly thought she was joking. "You're dumping trash into my quarry," I said slowly. Linda shrugged. Her smile didn't move. "You call it a quarry," she replied. "The HOA calls it an unmaintained hazard." My stomach twisted. Behind her, the dump truck bed lowered with a metallic groan. "So here's the situation," Linda continued, as if she were explaining parking rules at an HOA meeting. "Either you cooperate with the association and allow us to manage this land properly, or we take the matter to the county." I stared at her. "What does that mean?" Linda tilted her head slightly, like the answer should have been obvious. "It means," she said softly, "we'll make sure the county decides the land isn't really yours to keep." The wind moved across the quarry and carried the smell of construction dust and rotten insulation up the cliff. That's when it hit me. This wasn't random dumping. This was a plan. The HOA didn't just want to use my land. They were trying to take it. And standing there on the edge of that pit, watching trash float across the water my grandfather'd spent his life digging out of solid rock, I realized something that made my blood run cold. I had no idea yet how far they were willing to go. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. To understand why seeing that dump truck made my blood boil, you have to understand what that quarry actually was. Most people looked at it and saw an old hole in the ground. To my family, it was 40 years of sweat carved into stone. My grandfather, Walter Mercer, bought that land back in the early 1970s when nobody wanted it. The property was mostly rock and scrub brush, the kind of land farmers passed over because nothing grew there. But my grandfather saw something different. He saw limestone, and limestone meant work. For nearly 3 decades, he ran a small quarry there with nothing but stubborn determination and a handful of rented machines. The stories my dad used to tell made it sound almost unbelievable now, long days. Blasting rock out of the hillside, trucks hauling crushed stone to highway crews, dust covering everything within a mile. It wasn't glamorous, but it built our family. The quarry paid for my father's education. It paid for my grandmother's medical bills. It paid for the small farmhouse that still sits at the top of the ridge overlooking the pit. Eventually, the work slowed down. New regulations came in, bigger companies took over the contracts, and by the time I was in college, the quarry had closed for good. Nature slowly took it back. Rainwater and groundwater began filling the pit, turning the bottom into a deep, clear basin. Over the years, the water turned a strange turquoise color from the minerals in the rock. Locals started calling it Mercier Basin. Kids from town would sometimes sneak through the woods to swim there in the summer. I never chased them away. It felt wrong to guard the place like a prison when my grandfather had spent his life building it for the community. To me, it was peaceful, quiet, the kind of place you could sit for hours and hear nothing but wind across the stone walls. For years, nobody bothered us. Then the developers arrived. About 8 years ago, a man named Brian Halstead bought several hundred acres of farmland just east of our property. Within a year, construction crews started rolling in. Roads were cut through the fields, utility poles went up, and the open countryside slowly transformed into a sprawling subdivision called Stonebridge Hills. The advertisements were everywhere. Luxury country living, quiet natural surroundings, scenic views, and peaceful community life. And for a while, that's exactly what it looked like. Families moved in. New houses popped up along freshly paved streets. The neighborhood held summer cookouts and Halloween decorating contests. They even invited me to one of their first block parties. That was also when the HOA appeared. At first, it seemed harmless. A homeowners association that handled landscaping around the entrance sign, a monthly newsletter about community events, reminders about lawn maintenance and parking rules, normal suburban stuff. For the first couple of years, I barely thought about them. Then the board elections happened. That's when Linda Caraway took control. Linda had moved into Stonebridge Hills during the second phase of development. From what I heard, she used to manage corporate properties somewhere in the city. The moment she became HOA president, the entire tone of the neighborhood changed. Suddenly, everything was about property values. Rules multiplied. Driveways had to be spotless. Mailboxes had to match a specific design. Paint colors needed approval from a committee that Linda personally chaired. And slowly, the list of things she considered problems started growing. Old barns, utility trailers, backyard sheds, anything that didn't look polished enough for her version of a perfect community. Eventually, her attention drifted toward the land beyond the neighborhood fence, my land, the quarry. At first, it showed up as little comments during HOA meetings. I heard about them through neighbors who occasionally stopped by my property line while walking their dogs. Linda thought the quarry looked abandoned. She said it lowered the image of the neighborhood. One person even mentioned hearing her say it would make a beautiful private park for Stonebridge Hills residents. I laughed it off when I first heard that. The quarry sat on private property that had been in my family for half a century. No HOA board was going to touch it, or so I thought. Then one morning I walked the fence line like I usually did and noticed something that stopped me cold. One section of the wire fence had been cut clean through, not bent, not broken by animals. Cut. The metal strands hung loose like someone had taken bolt cutters straight to them. At first I thought maybe kids had snuck in again. But when I looked closer, I saw something else. Fresh tire tracks. Deep tread marks leading straight through the gap in the fence. They ran across the dirt path and disappeared down the slope toward the quarry. I remember standing there for a long moment, staring at those tracks and feeling a strange knot tighten in my stomach. Something about it didn't feel random, and a few days later, the first official letter arrived. It came in a certified envelope stamped with the Stonebridge Hills HOA logo. Inside was a formal notice claiming the Mercer Quarry had been classified as a community safety hazard. According to the HOA board, the land posed a potential danger to nearby residents and required immediate development or structural mitigation. At the bottom of the letter was a line that made my jaw tighten. If I failed to take corrective action, the HOA would pursue legal measures with the county to address the hazard. That was the moment I realized something important. This wasn't about safety. This wasn't about appearances. The HOA wanted the quarry, and the fight for it had already begun. The first time I confronted the HOA about the quarry, it wasn't on my land, it was in their meeting room. Stonebridge Hills held their monthly HOA meetings in a community center just inside the neighborhood entrance. I'd never attended one before, but after receiving that letter calling my family's land a community hazard, I decided it was time to see exactly what they were planning. The room was already full when I arrived. Rows of folding chairs faced a long table where the HOA board sat like a panel of judges. Most of the people in the audience were residents, couples, retirees, a few younger families. But the mood in the room felt strangely tense, like everyone already knew something controversial was about to happen. And at the center of it all sat Linda Caraway. She looked completely comfortable behind the table, a laptop open in front of her and a small projector set up beside it. On either side of her were the rest of the board members. Trevor Maddox, the HOA treasurer, a thin man with sharp glasses and the permanent expression of someone who enjoyed calculating other people's money. Claudia Rennick, the compliance officer who seemed to take personal satisfaction in handing out violation notices. And Dennis Calder, the HOA's attorney who sat slightly apart from the others with a legal pad and a quiet, watchful expression. When Linda noticed me walk in, her smile widened just slightly. "Perfect timing," she said once the meeting started. "Mr. Mercer has joined us." The projector flickered to life behind her. The first slide appeared on the wall, a photograph of my quarry, taken from the ridge above it. "This," Linda began calmly, "is the Mercer Basin Quarry located directly adjacent to the Stonebridge Hills residential community." Another slide appeared, a zoomed-in image of the rock walls and water below. "As many residents have expressed concern," she continued, "this abandoned quarry presents both a safety risk and a negative visual impact on neighborhood property values." A murmur passed through the room. I stood up. "It's not abandoned," I said. Linda didn't even look at me at first. She just clicked to the next slide, another photo, this one showing the quarry from a different angle. "Mr. Mercer," she said politely, "your land has been unused for years. The HOA board believes the situation requires responsible management." "Responsible management?" I repeated. "That land is private property. It's been legally zoned for decades." Now Linda finally turned toward me. Her smile stayed perfectly polite. "Of course," she said. "But when a property becomes a potential hazard to the surrounding community, the county has certain rights to intervene." Trevor Maddox leaned into his microphone. "The board is proposing a resolution," he announced, "that would allow the Stonebridge Hills HOA to petition the county for temporary oversight of the quarry property." Several residents shifted in their seats. My stomach tightened. "You're asking the county to take control of my land," I said. Claudia Rennick spoke next. "Only to ensure public safety," she said sweetly. Dennis Calder scribbled something quietly on his legal pad but didn't look up. I could feel the room watching me. "So that's the plan," I said. "You call it unsafe? Then try to take it." Linda folded her hands together on the table. "We're protecting the community," she replied smoothly. The vote didn't happen that night, but the message was clear. They weren't bluffing. And after that meeting, things started getting strange. At first it was small things. A couple of men wearing reflective safety vests showed up one afternoon near my fence line claiming to be conducting a site inspection. When I asked who authorized it, they mumbled something about HOA compliance checks and left quickly. Then the letters started. Violation notices, warnings, complaints about things that had nothing to do with the quarry. One claimed an old equipment trailer on my property was visually disruptive to neighborhood standards. Another said the paint on my barn roof was faded and inconsistent with community appearance. The HOA didn't have jurisdiction over my property, but they kept sending the notices anyway, almost like they were trying to bury me in paperwork. Then the dumping started. The first pile appeared near the lower road leading to the quarry. Broken concrete blocks and a few bags of construction debris. I assumed it was someone cutting corners with their trash disposal. I cleaned it up and hauled it away myself. 2 days later, another pile appeared. This one bigger. Drywall scraps, roof shingles, a cracked sink. It kept happening. Every time I cleared the mess, more showed up. Soon it wasn't just trash bags anymore, it was appliances, cabinets, insulation, entire truckloads of contractor debris. And every time I drove down to the quarry, I had the same thought. This wasn't random dumping. Someone was doing it on purpose. The night I decided to prove it, I drove into town and bought 4 trail cameras from a hunting supply store. They were the kind hunters used to track deer motion-activated, infrared night vision, capable of recording clear footage in total darkness. I spent the evening mounting them around the quarry, one near the cut section of fence, one overlooking the access road, and 2 hidden in the trees along the ridge. Then I waited. 2 nights later, my phone buzzed with the first motion alert. I sat at my kitchen table watching the footage load onto the screen. At first, all I saw were headlights. a truck backing slowly down the dirt road toward the quarry. Then the camera angle shifted as the vehicle passed closer. The company logo on the door came into focus. And the moment I read the name printed on that truck, my stomach dropped. Because the company didn't belong to some random contractor. It was listed right there in the Stonebridge Hills HOA financial records. The truck dumping garbage on my land was being paid by the HOA itself. The moment I realized the HOA was behind the dumping, I stopped trying to handle it quietly. The next morning, I called the county environmental office. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't accuse anyone by name yet. I simply told them the truth construction debris was being dumped repeatedly on private land, and I had reason to believe it was organized. 2 days later, a county truck rolled down the dirt road toward the quarry. A man stepped out carrying a clipboard and a small metal case of testing equipment. "Martin Velez," he said, shaking my hand. "Environmental compliance." We walked down the slope together toward the basin. The deeper we went, the worse it looked. What used to be clear rock and water now had piles of construction debris scattered across the edges. Broken drywall floated near the shoreline. Pieces of insulation clung to the rocks like dirty snow. A shattered washing machine lay half submerged at the waterline. Martin crouched beside a pile of debris and began collecting samples into small plastic containers. "How long has this been happening?" he asked. "A few weeks," I said. "Maybe longer." He nodded slowly but didn't say much. For the next hour, he took photographs, labeled bags, and scraped soil from several locations near the dumping sites. When he finally stood up again, he looked toward the water and sighed. "This isn't just trash dumping," he said. "Some of this material could contain contaminants." My stomach tightened. "What kind of contaminants?" He pointed toward a cluster of torn insulation and cracked paint buckets near the rock wall. "Construction chemicals, lead-based materials, industrial adhesives, sometimes even asbestos if it comes from older renovations." I stared at the debris. "If that stuff leaks into the groundwater," Martin finished the sentence for me, "the property owner is usually responsible for cleanup." The words hit me like a punch to the ribs. "You're saying they can dump poison on my land and I'm the one who pays for it?" Martin didn't answer directly. Instead, he closed his sample case and said something that made my skin crawl. "You should document everything from this point forward." That was the moment I realized the dumping wasn't just harassment, it was a setup. And while I was trying to deal with the environmental damage, Linda Caraway was escalating her campaign in the neighborhood. The letters from the HOA started arriving almost every week. Official notices, legal warnings, threats of fines. One document accused me of maintaining what they called an attractive nuisance, a property condition that could supposedly endanger Stonebridge Hills residents. Another letter claimed the quarry created visual degradation for nearby homes. Then Linda went even further. At the next HOA meeting, she stood in front of the entire neighborhood and announced that the Mercer property had become an illegal dumping site. My dumping site. According to her, the quarry was attracting contractors who were illegally disposing of waste. She spoke like she was protecting the neighborhood from me, and some of the residents believed her. I noticed it almost immediately. Neighbors who used to wave while walking their dogs stopped making eye contact. A couple who had once chatted with me at the property line crossed the street when they saw my truck. Linda had turned the story around. She made it look like the dumping was my fault. And the worst part was, the trash kept getting worse. A week after Martin's inspection, I drove down to the quarry and saw something that made my chest tighten. The piles were bigger now. Much bigger. Industrial debris, stacks of insulation, metal drums, and dozens of cracked paint cans leaking dried chemical residue across the limestone. I called Martin immediately. When he arrived and saw the new piles, his expression darkened. "This just crossed into a different category," he said quietly. He pointed at the paint containers and the chemical stains spreading across the rocks. "If hazardous material gets into the basin water, this becomes an environmental remediation site." "And that means what exactly?" Martin looked straight at me. "It means millions in cleanup costs." For a moment, I couldn't even speak. The HOA wasn't just harassing me. They were poisoning my land. And if the contamination spread far enough, the county could declare the property unsafe and seize control of it. Exactly what Linda had threatened from the beginning. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I stepped onto the porch of the farmhouse overlooking the quarry. The air was cold and quiet. For a while, I just stood there listening to the wind moving through the trees. Then I heard something else, an engine. Low and distant at first, but getting closer. Headlights appeared through the trees along the access road, another truck, but this time I wasn't watching alone. A second silhouette stepped out of the shadows beside the porch railing. Raymond Pike, my closest neighbor and a retired county sheriff who had lived in the area longer than I had. He held a pair of binoculars in one hand. Thought they might try again tonight, he said calmly. Down below us, the truck rolled slowly toward the quarry edge. Raymond lowered the binoculars and reached for his phone. Let's see what happens when they get caught this time, he said. And together we watched the truck back toward the rim of the pit. Raymond Pike didn't panic when he saw the truck. That's the difference between someone who spent 30 years wearing a badge and someone like me who had just watched his family's land get turned into a garbage pit. While I was still trying to process what we were seeing, Raymond calmly pulled out his phone. Don't move, he said quietly. Down below us, the truck rolled slowly down the access road toward the quarry rim. Its headlights swept across the limestone walls like two searchlights, briefly illuminating the piles of trash already scattered along the edge. The driver backed the vehicle toward the drop-off. The hydraulic bed started lifting. Raymond raised his phone to his ear. County Dispatch, he said in the same steady voice he probably used for decades. This is Raymond Pike, retired sheriff. I've got an active illegal dumping in progress at the Mercer property quarry. I felt a strange surge of adrenaline in my chest. The dump bed tilted higher. A pile of debris slid toward the edge. Deputies should be there in about 8 minutes, Raymond said after hanging up. 8 minutes suddenly felt like a long time. The truck driver clearly thought he was alone. He hopped out of the cab and walked toward the back of the truck to check the load sliding toward the rim. That was when the motion lights snapped on. 4 floodlights mounted along the quarry ridge burst to life at once, lighting up the entire area like a stadium. The driver froze. He looked around wildly, and then he saw us standing on the ridge. For a moment, we just stared at each other across the pit. Then panic hit him. He scrambled back into the truck and slammed the door. The hydraulic bed dropped halfway down as he hit the gas, trying to pull away before law enforcement arrived. But in his rush, he forgot something. As the truck lurched forward, a stack of papers sitting on the passenger seat slid out of the open door and scattered across the gravel road. The truck disappeared into the trees seconds later. Raymond exhaled slowly. Well, he said, that's not how they planned that night to go. We walked down to the road where the papers had fallen. Most of them were invoices, work orders, delivery logs. At first, they just looked like ordinary contractor documents. Then I noticed the company letterhead at the top of one page, Ridgeline Property Services, the same name that had appeared on the truck in my trail camera footage. But the real shock was printed halfway down the page. Authorization signature, Linda Caraway. My chest tightened as I flipped through the rest of the papers. Every single work order was the same: debris transport, construction waste removal, a Croft disposal site, Mercer Basin Quarry. This wasn't random dumping. This was scheduled, organized, approved by the HOA itself. Raymond looked over my shoulder as I held the papers under the porch light. Well, he said slowly, that's one hell of a paper trail. The next morning I started making calls. By the end of the week, I was sitting across a conference table from a woman named Elena Whitaker. Elena was a property rights attorney out of Springfield who had built a reputation for taking on cases most lawyers avoided. She had sharp eyes, short dark hair, and a kind of focused calm that made it obvious she'd spent years dismantling people in courtrooms. I laid the evidence across the table: camera footage, photographs, and the stack of invoices we'd recovered from the truck. Elena didn't interrupt while I explained everything that had been happening. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and folded her hands together. Well, she said, that's bold. Bold? I asked. Illegal, she corrected calmly. She tapped one of the invoices. This isn't just trespassing, Caleb. This is organized disposal of construction waste on private land. She opened a folder and started making notes. If hazardous materials are involved, we're talking environmental violations, property damage, and civil liability. I felt a small spark of hope begin to grow. But Elena wasn't finished. "Let's look at the HOA financials," she said. Over the next few days, her team began digging through Stonebridge Hill's records. What they found was even worse than I expected. The HOA had paid Ridgeline Property Services more than $40,000 over the past 2 months. Every payment labeled as debris removal from construction projects inside the neighborhood, meaning the residents of Stonebridge Hills had unknowingly funded the operation themselves. But the discovery that truly changed everything came from the HOA's own bylaws. Elena called me into her office late one afternoon. She slid a printed document across the desk. "Read Section 12, she said. I scanned the paragraph slowly, then I read it again just to make sure I understood it correctly. The clause stated that any HOA board member who knowingly authorized illegal actions outside the authority of the association could be held personally liable for damages. Personally, meaning the HOA insurance wouldn't protect them, meaning their own homes, savings, and assets could be at risk. I looked up at Elena. "Linda signed those work orders." Elena nodded. "So did the treasurer and the compliance officer." A slow smile spread across her face. "They thought they were bullying a landowner," she said. "They accidentally created evidence of a conspiracy." For the first time since this entire nightmare started, I felt the balance shift. Elena gathered the documents into a neat stack and slid them back into the folder. "I'll draft the complaint tonight," she said. "What kind of complaint?" She looked directly at me. "The kind that changes people's careers." 2 weeks later, Elena Whitaker filed the lawsuit against the Stonebridge Hills HOA. Trespassing, illegal dumping, environmental contamination, property damage, civil conspiracy, and personal liability against the board members who authorized it. When I read the final filing, one thought kept running through my mind. Linda Caraway didn't just pick the wrong land to mess with. She picked the wrong land to mess with. She picked the wrong fight. Once the lawsuit was filed, things stopped being quiet. Until then, Linda Caraway had been operating behind the scenes, letters, inspections, quiet pressure. But the moment the legal paperwork hit the courthouse records, everything changed. Stonebridge Hills exploded into rumors, and the investigation began moving fast. One of the first people Elena brought in was an environmental engineer named Dr. Naomi Serrano. She arrived early one morning with a small team and a truck full of equipment that looked more like something from a scientific field lab than a construction site. Naomi was calm, methodical, and extremely precise. The kind of person who spoke softly, but made it clear she didn't miss details. We walked down to the quarry together while her team set up testing stations along the rim. She studied the debris piles for a long moment before saying anything. "This is worse than basic dumping," she said finally. Then she pointed toward a cluster of cracked paint containers and insulation bundles near the waterline. "Construction waste like this often contains solvents, adhesives, and chemical compounds that can seep into groundwater." Her team spent the next 2 days collecting samples, soil cores, water tests, air readings. Every pile of debris was photographed, cataloged, and mapped. By the time Naomi finished her inspection, the quarry looked less like a crime scene and more like a forensic investigation. 3 days later, her official report arrived. I still remember sitting in Elena's office while she flipped through the pages. The report confirmed exactly what we feared: lead traces in the soil, industrial sealants, paint residue, and early signs of chemical seepage into the upper layer of the basin water. Naomi's conclusion was blunt. The dumping had created measurable environmental contamination, and if it continued, the cleanup costs could easily reach into the millions. Elena leaned back in her chair and tapped the report with a pen. "Well," she said calmly, "that just multiplied our case." From that point on, the evidence started stacking up faster than anyone expected. The trail cameras captured multiple trucks entering the property. Invoices connected those trucks directly to Ridgeline Property Services. Witnesses from inside the neighborhood began quietly reaching out once the lawsuit became public. One contractor admitted he had been told the quarry was an approved disposal site authorized by the HOA board. Another resident produced emails discussing construction cleanup contracts tied to Linda's office. But while we were building our case, Linda wasn't sitting still. If anything, she doubled down. Within weeks, she began pushing a new proposal through the HOA board. Her plan was simple. If the quarry could be officially classified by the county as a permanent landfill site, then the dumping could be retroactively justified. In other words, she wanted to turn the crime into a legal designation. The problem for her was that Elena had already anticipated that move. The moment Linda filed her request with the county, Elena submitted the environmental report and dumping evidence alongside it. Suddenly, the county wasn't reviewing a harmless zoning request. They were reviewing potential environmental violations. That changed the conversation overnight. But the biggest shift didn't come from the courthouse. It came from inside Stonebridge Hills itself. Once residents began learning where their HOA dues had actually gone, the mood in the neighborhood turned fast. People were angry. Monthly fees that were supposed to maintain parks and landscaping had instead paid contractors to dump construction debris onto someone else's land. Neighbors who had avoided me for weeks started knocking on my door again. Some came with questions, others came with information. One evening, a woman named Janet Holloway showed up at the farmhouse carrying a folder thick with paperwork. Janet lived 3 streets inside Stonebridge Hills and had been part of the community since the neighborhood was first built. She placed the folder on my kitchen table and said something that surprised me. Half the neighborhood wants Linda gone. Inside the folder were signatures, dozens of them. Residents demanding a recall vote for the HOA board. Janet had quietly started organizing homeowners who felt betrayed by the leadership, and the movement was growing quickly. By the end of the week, the recall petition had spread across the neighborhood. Linda must have realized the pressure was building, because 3 days later she made a move her own. An official notice went out to every homeowner in Stonebridge Hills. Emergency HOA meeting. Full community attendance requested. Agenda, discussion, and vote regarding the Mercer Quarry property. When Elena read the notice, she smiled slightly. She thinks she's still in control, she said. What's she planning? I asked. Elena folded the notice and slid it back across the desk. My guess, she plans to push a vote that allows the HOA to seize the quarry before this lawsuit finishes. I felt my stomach tighten. That room will be full of her supporters. Elena stood and walked to the window, staring out toward the courthouse square. Then she said something that made me feel the same shift I'd felt the day she discovered the HOA liability clause. That's fine, she turned back toward me, because that meeting is exactly where we want this to happen. I frowned. What do you mean? Elena's expression didn't change. Let her gather the whole neighborhood, she said calmly. Let her stand in front of everyone and try to take your land. Then she picked up a thick folder sitting on her desk. Inside it were camera stills, contractor invoices, Naomi Serrano's environmental report, and the HOA financial records linking everything together. And she tapped the folder once. Because when that meeting starts, she said, we're going to show them the truth. The night of the emergency HOA meeting felt different before I even stepped inside the building. Cars filled every parking space around the Stonebridge Hills Community Center. Headlights stretched down the road like a line outside a concert. Residents stood in small clusters near the entrance, talking in low voices, some angry, some nervous, others just curious about what was about to happen. Word had spread through the entire neighborhood. People knew about the lawsuit. They knew about the dumping. And most importantly, they knew their HOA dues might have paid for it. When Elena and I walked toward the entrance, conversation slowed. A few neighbors nodded at me. Others watched carefully, trying to read the situation like spectators before a boxing match. Inside, the room was already packed. Rows of folding chairs were filled wall to wall. Late arrivals stood along the back and near the doorways. The low hum of voices echoed off the walls as everyone waited for the meeting to start. At the front of the room sat the HOA board table, and at the center of it was Linda Caraway. She looked completely composed. In fact, she looked confident. Her laptop was open, a projector ready beside it, just like the night I'd first confronted her months earlier. Trevor Maddox sat to her left with a stack of documents, while Claudia Rennick shuffled papers with an irritated expression. Dennis Calder, the HOA attorney, sat quietly at the end of the table with his usual legal pad. Linda glanced up when she noticed Elena and me enter. For just a second our eyes met, then she smiled, not a nervous smile, a victorious one, the kind people wear when they believe the outcome is already decided. Elena and I took 2 empty chairs near the front row. She placed a thick folder of documents on her lap and leaned slightly toward me. Just let her talk, she whispered. The meeting started a few minutes later. Linda tapped the microphone in front of her and the room slowly quieted. "Thank you all for attending this emergency session of the Stonebridge Hills Homeowners Association," she began. Her voice was calm and controlled, like she had rehearsed every word. "As many of you know, the property directly bordering our community, commonly referred to as the Mercer Quarry, has recently become the subject of legal disputes and safety concerns." A few people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. Linda clicked the projector remote. The first image appeared on the wall behind her, a photograph of the quarry, the same one she had used months earlier. "The board has spent considerable time reviewing the risks associated with this abandoned excavation site," she continued. "Our responsibility is to protect the safety and property values of Stonebridge Hills residents." She clicked again. Another photo, this time showing piles of construction debris along the quarry edge. Linda gestured toward the image. "As you can see, the site has become an active dumping ground." A few murmurs moved through the room. She paused just long enough for the implication to sink in. Then she said the part she had clearly been building toward. "For that reason, the board has submitted a petition to the county requesting temporary oversight of the Mercer Basin property." The murmuring grew louder. Linda raised her voice slightly. "Our proposal would allow the HOA to secure and properly manage the land while the legal situation is resolved. In other words, take the quarry." I stayed quiet. Exactly like Elena had told me. Linda continued presenting her argument, explaining how the HOA could transform the quarry into a controlled green space or community park. Trevor Maddox handed out copies of the proposal to several residents in the front rows. For a moment, it actually looked like Linda believed she had the room. But then the questions started. A man near the middle row stood up. Why were HOA funds paying a contractor that dumped garbage there? The room went silent. Linda's smile tightened slightly. "That claim is currently part of ongoing litigation," she replied carefully. Another resident spoke up. "If the HOA had nothing to do with the dumping, why is our name on the invoices?" Now the tension in the room was obvious. Claudia Rennick leaned toward Linda and whispered something urgently. Linda cleared her throat. "As I've already explained, those allegations are unproven." More voices began speaking at once. "Then why are we being sued? Why were our dues used for debris removal? Why weren't residents told about any of this?" The room grew louder. Linda's calm began to crack. She tapped the microphone sharply. "Order," she snapped. The microphone sharply. "This meeting will remain civil." Then she looked directly toward the audience. "The board will now proceed with the vote regarding the Mercer property petition." Ballots were handed out. People began whispering again. Tension thick in the air. Linda folded her hands together like she was ready to end the entire fight with a single decision. That was when Elena stood up. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room immediately. "Madam President," she said. The room turned toward her. Linda's eyes narrowed. "Yes," she said sharply. Elena held up a folder. "My client and I would like to address the room before the vote takes place." Dennis Calder shifted slightly in his chair. Linda hesitated for a moment, clearly irritated. Then she forced a polite smile. "You have 2 minutes." Elena walked calmly to the front of the room. She placed the folder on the table beside the projector. The entire room watched in complete silence. Then she opened the folder and looked directly at the HOA board. And in a calm, steady voice, she said one sentence that made the air in the room feel suddenly electric. "We'd like to play a video first." For a moment after Elena said it, the room was completely silent. Linda Caraway sat frozen behind the board table, her confident smile tightening as Elena reached for the projector cable. Dennis Calder, the HOA attorney, leaned forward. "What video?" he asked sharply. Elena didn't answer him. Instead, she plugged a small drive into the laptop beside the projector and clicked once. The screen behind Linda flickered. Then the footage appeared. At first it was dark, grainy night vision from one of the trail cameras mounted along the quarry ridge. A pair of headlights rolled slowly into view. The timestamp glowed in the corner of the video. The truck backed toward the edge of the quarry. The hydraulic bed lifted, and thousands of pounds of construction debris began sliding down into the basin. A murmur swept through the room. Then Elena skipped forward. Another clip. Another truck. Different night. Same location. More drywall. Broken cabinets, shingles, insulation. Someone near the back of the room gasped. Linda's face had gone completely still. Elena let the footage continue for several more seconds before pausing it on a clear frame showing the company logo on the truck door. Ridgeline Property Services, she said calmly. Trevor Maddox shifted in his chair. That proves nothing, he muttered. Elena picked up a stack of papers from the folder. Actually, she replied, it proves quite a lot. She placed one of the documents under the projector. The image appeared large on the wall behind Linda. An invoice. Ridgeline Property Services. Construction debris removal. Approved disposal site Mercer Basin Quarry. And at the bottom of the page, authorization signature. Linda Caraway. The room exploded. Voices rose all around us. What is that? That's her signature. Those are HOA funds. Elena raised a hand slightly, letting the noise roll through the room for a few seconds before speaking again. And that's only the beginning. She lifted another document. This one was thicker. Official letterhead across the top. Environmental Impact Assessment, prepared by Dr. Naomi Serrano. Elena opened it and turned the pages slowly under the projector. Soil samples from the Mercer Basin property show contamination from industrial paints, chemical adhesives, and construction solvents. The murmuring turned into angry shouting. A man near the front stood up. "We told us the quarry was the problem," another resident shouted from the back. "You were dumping the trash there yourselves." Linda slammed her hand on the table. "This is manipulation," she snapped. "Those documents are part of ongoing litigation and cannot." The doors at the back of the room suddenly opened. Everyone turned. 3 people walked in, 2 county environmental officials, and behind them, 2 uniformed deputies. A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. Martin Velez stepped forward holding a folder of his own. "We've reviewed the environmental report submitted with the Mercer lawsuit," he said clearly. "And we've also received contractor statements confirming that Ridgeline Property Services was hired by the Stonebridge Hills HOA board to dispose of construction waste at that site." Linda stood up abruptly. "This is outrageous," she said. "The HOA has never authorized illegal dumping." Elena calmly lifted another page from the stack. "Work order authorization. Signed, Linda Caraway, Trevor Maddox, Claudia Rennick." The deputies exchanged a glance. Dennis Calder rubbed his forehead slowly, and the residents of Stonebridge Hills began turning toward the board table with a completely different expression: anger, betrayal. One woman stood up near the front. "You used our money for this?" Another voice shouted from the back. "You tried to blame him." Linda's composure finally cracked. "You don't understand the situation," she said sharply. "The quarry was already a hazard. And that hazard," Elena interrupted calmly, "was created by your own contractors." She placed one final document on the projector, a section from the HOA bylaws, highlighted. Personal Liability Clause. If HOA board members knowingly authorize illegal actions outside the authority of the association, Elena read aloud, they may be held personally responsible for resulting damages. The room fell silent again. But this time it was a different kind of silence. Trevor Maddox looked like he might be sick. Claudia Rennick stared down at the table. Linda slowly lowered herself back into her chair. And then the shouting started again. "Remove them. They need to resign. You lied to the entire neighborhood." Janet Holloway stepped forward from the crowd holding the recall petition. "We demand an immediate vote to remove this board," she said firmly. The deputies remained near the doorway while the residents gathered around the front of the room. The power in that room had shifted completely. Linda looked around the crowd of angry homeowners. For the first time since this entire fight started, she had no control left. Within weeks, the legal battle ended. Faced with overwhelming evidence, the Stonebridge Hills HOA settled the lawsuit. $7 million, damages, environmental cleanup, legal costs, and the full restoration of the Mercer Quarry. Linda Caraway resigned from the HOA board before the settlement was finalized. Trevor Maddox and Claudia Rennick followed soon after. The board that once tried to seize my land collapsed almost overnight, and the neighborhood that once believed Linda's story finally understood the truth. The strange thing about winning a fight like that is how quiet everything becomes afterward. For months it felt like every day brought another argument, another letter, another meeting filled with tension and accusations. Lawyers, inspectors, cameras, evidence every moment felt like standing in the middle of a storm. Then suddenly, it was over. The settlement forced the Stonebridge Hills HOA to fund the full restoration of the quarry. Within weeks, crews began arriving at Mercer Basin, not to dump trash this time, but to remove it. Heavy equipment rolled down the same access road where the trucks had once sneaked in at night. Excavators carefully lifted piles of construction debris from the quarry rim. Dumpsters were filled with drywall, insulation, broken appliances, and chemical containers that had been scattered across the limestone. Environmental teams monitored every step. Contaminated soil was removed. The water along the basin edge was filtered and treated. Sections of damaged rock were stabilized to prevent runoff from spreading further into the groundwater. For months, the cleanup continued. Slowly, piece by piece, the land began to look like itself again. One afternoon, I stood on the ridge and watched the final truck pull away from the quarry. For the first time in nearly a year, the water below was clear again. Not perfect yet, but healing. Meanwhile, things inside Stonebridge Hills changed just as dramatically. The residents who had packed that community meeting didn't stop with removing Linda Caraway. The entire HOA board was replaced. The recall vote happened only a week after the lawsuit settlement became public. Nearly every homeowner in the neighborhood showed up. When the votes were counted, the result wasn't even close. Linda's leadership was officially erased from the neighborhood she had tried so hard to control. In her place, the residents elected someone who had stood up when it mattered most. Janet Holloway. Janet never wanted power, but she understood something the previous board never had. An HOA is supposed to represent neighbors, not rule over them. One of her first decisions as president was to make the HOA finances completely transparent. Monthly reports were shared with every homeowner. Spending decisions required community approval. No more secret contracts, no more quiet deals behind closed doors, and no more pretending the HOA had authority over land that wasn't theirs. But the biggest change happened at the quarry itself. Once the cleanup was complete, the county approved a new designation for the Mercer property. Not a landfill, not a hazard, a protected natural area. With a little help from the community, we built a simple overlook path along the ridge and a small walking trail through the trees that surrounded the basin. No gates, no fences, just a place where people could come and enjoy the land the way my grandfather had always hoped. On the first weekend the trail officially opened, dozens of families showed up. Kids skipped stones across the water. Parents sat on the benches overlooking the basin. Neighbors who once avoided my property line now stopped to talk again. The tension that had hung over the land for months was gone, and for the first time since all of this began, the place felt peaceful again. One evening not long after the trail opened, I walked out to the same ridge where I used to stand with my grandfather when I was a kid. The sun was setting behind the limestone walls, turning the water below into a deep blue mirror. From the trail I could hear children laughing as they ran along the path. For a moment I just stood there listening, thinking about how close I had come to losing all of it, not just the land, but the history behind it. My grandfather had spent decades carving that quarry out of solid rock with nothing but determination and stubborn pride. He believed land was something you protected, something you passed forward to the next generation, and for a while, it looked like a group of HOA board members had nearly stolen that legacy with paperwork and intimidation. But in the end, something stronger pushed back. Truth, evidence, and a community that finally realized power should never belong to the loudest voice in the room. It should belong to the people who live there. As the sun dipped lower over the basin, the sound of laughter drifted up from the trail again. I sat down on the edge of the ridge and watched the light fade across the water. For the first time in a long time, Mercer Basin was exactly what it was meant to be. Quiet, peaceful, home. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?